I'm Kara Sundar.
And I'm Adnan Ali. And today we're talking about the modern workplace, which in many cases is global, spans multiple geographies and cultures. So today our teams are distributed, and in many ways, that's an asset, not a barrier. So, how can we really leverage our global brain power, this think tank of colleagues that we have around the globe? That's what we'll be talking about today.
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize, let's say that you have recently inherited a global team. You're used to working kind of co-located, one culture, and
Mhm.
now you've got people all around the world that you need to collaborate with at the same level of productivity. Something to keep in mind is, the storming, norming, performing. Your team is going to have to go through that. So, what we're talking about today is tips and tricks to make sure that your team can get to that performing place quicker. But if you think that you're just going to hop right over any kind of storming to performing, build that into your expectations and don't get discouraged because that's just reality.
Absolutely. And the only thing I would add to that is what's worked well in a co located team dynamic
Mm,
doesn't necessarily work well for a distributed team. And that can be global in many cases, but even
hmm
in distributed teams where you're in different cities in the same country, you'll find that the way of working truly does have to evolve to accommodate and meet that distributed model.
Absolutely. I think particularly about building trust with you as their new leader.
Mhm.
They don't see you interacting with colleagues in the hallway. They don't see you going out to lunch with them and, just having a conversation about your day. A lot of your time will be spent in actual meetings with agendas and, really talking about work. So I would say when you inherit a new team that's distributed, think about how you want to communicate and what your
Right.
expectations are. So, for example, I've seen a lot of managers go wrong where they may have a reaction to something that they expected to be brought in on sooner.
Mhm.
The team doesn't want to bother them until something's really gone wrong, and then it's a fire drill. And so the new manager says, you should tell me about this sooner. And all of a sudden, the team becomes crippled and they can't make any decisions without that manager. And it's kind of the whiplash effect. So I would recommend, as a manager with a new team, you bring them together in some way and say, listen, this is what my expectation is. Here's how I'm going to communicate with you. Here's how I expect you to communicate with me. We'll have a team meeting once a month and talk about all the things going on, whatever that might look like. But it'll help you get through some of that storming that could potentially
Mhm.
happen if something goes wrong in those first couple of months before you've built up that trust and those expectations.
And that's so important to do because one of the things that you lose out by being globally distributed that you really have to take some time to recreate is that environment of just the sidebar. So you don't have the luxury of
Yes,
being able to just walk over to someone's desk and ask a quick
exactly.
question. And you forget that, right? A lot of times
Exactly.
in our co-located teams, we take for granted that I can just walk up to the next desk over and get a quick answer to a question, or I can walk to my boss's office, which is just a few steps away, and get clarification on something, and I can continue my day and continue to work. And you don't have that luxury when you're globally distributed. So you really have to invest the time to make sure that you've figured out what the communication approach is going to be for the team, and then also schedule that time proactively because you're not going to
Mm-hmm.
get those moments. So you have to schedule those moments ahead of time because they're so valuable in our day to day productivity.
That's a great point. And thinking too about that team identity, they may have an understanding of how they need to interact with you,
Mhm.
but how to interact with one another. So
Right.
if you have people all over the world, in theory, you've hired the best and brightest people
Oh, yeah.
literally in the entire world to be on your team. They need to be able to leverage one another because there
Hmm.
is no one employee out there that's going to be able to bear the weight of the whole team. Let each other help. So, how do you do that? I think having that dedicated space, like in a team meeting
Hmm.
where different team members maybe take leadership, facilitating that meeting or talking about what the agenda needs to be. So something I've liked to do with my teams that I inherit is a strengths finder exercise.
Mm,
So that is one way of doing it. I mean, honestly, you could do any kind of personality test that resonates with you, but I like strengths finder because it focuses on what's positive and what the
right,
team can do to leverage one another. So if you have a team member that's super analytical and then you have a team member who's really strong in communication, that may be a great combination because they're not going to naturally be good at what the other person is good at as far as kind of communicating and also being super detailed. But together they could be super powerful.
right.
So that's something I recommend. Don't just view your team as, all the same worker bees out there doing their jobs. They really have a unique skill set, and that's going to help you grow them and grow, frankly, what your team can
Oh,
accomplish.
absolutely. It's that whole think tank mindset, right? You have all of
Yes,
these different capabilities. How do we optimize that amazing,
absolutely.
set of skills that we have? One of the things I would say about the Strengths Finder is to redo it every few
Yeah.
years, even,
Mm-hmm.
because I remember I did a Strengths Finder when I first started my career, 10, 11 years ago. And I just did it a few years ago, and it's like, wow, the evolution too of just your strengths and those emerging
Yeah.
capabilities and what you invest the time to build out, it changes, and it's important to have that reflection. Speaking of reflection, kind of taking it back to the communication and setting that expectation, I think it's important to also do those retrospectives and to
Mm,
reflect on how things are going. So just getting to that forming area, or that place of where you have a formed team that's working effectively, it's going to evolve. It's not a
mm,
constant steady state, right? It's one of those things that
right.
you'll get there, and then it'll continue to evolve because the nature of what you're working on. So be sure to set those retrospectives. And for leaders, I would really encourage you to create an environment where your team feels safe to provide feedback, because
Sure.
and depending on where you're located, where your teams are located, it'll vary by the culture too. So be mindful of that cultural element. So definitely do the retrospective,
Mm-hmm.
reflect on how things are working, what's working well. Maybe you can do more of that, what's not working so well, and where there's an improvement opportunity. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's going to be tremendous.
And if you ask for that feedback early and often, it will
Hmm.
give you more opportunities to give feedback on
Right.
not this that annual review, but to say,
Hmm.
hey, I noticed in this meeting, here's how you handled something. I might have handled that differently. And it won't feel so critical.
Right.
It'll be an ongoing conversation that's both ways.
Right. So important.
So something else we can talk about is time zones, because this
Oh
is a
yeah.
real challenge. You're in Hong Kong, I'm in Florida. We know a little thing
Oh
about
yeah.
this. And so, if you are, let's say, based far away from the majority of your team, or if you are based in the headquarters, let's say,
Hmm.
and the rest of your team is somewhere else, it's going to be so important for you to be flexible with your schedule. And I know that's hard when you have a family or maybe a long commute, but if you can make yourself available at strange times that may not be super convenient, it's also going to allow you to ask for that flexibility from others when it's necessary. So, particularly if you have a team that is truly around the world,
Hmm.
there are going to be some late nights, there's going to be some early mornings. But just it goes back to building that trust. Hey, our leader was willing to hop on at 10 p.m. when we were having our office meeting just to
Right.
participate, but that also means we're willing to wake up at 6 a.m. sometime and participate in his meeting.
It's definitely a give and take.
Yeah.
And I can just say, even for this podcast and what we're doing here, it is
Yeah.
9:30 p.m. for me, so very late in my evening, and I think it's early morning for you, right? So it's 8:30
Yeah.
where you're located,
Yeah.
and it's one of those things. It's a give and take. Um, sometimes it's a late night, sometimes it's an early morning,
Mm-hmm.
but it goes a long way, because also with things like decision making, you don't necessarily want it to go a day and a half in this case. If you're
Oh,
waiting until the
yeah.
perfect time for yourself, say you're the leader, you may have a decision that could have taken only a few hours to get to an agreement to lapse and go into a couple of days? And is that really what you want to? So I think the give and take, it's great to build trust, but also it just makes sure that it ensures that there's no bottlenecks throughout the process.
That's a great point. I want to talk too about kind of the care and feeding role of the
Mm,
manager. You know, if you're if you are a co-located team, you might take your coworkers out to lunch. You
hmm.
might have a happy hour
Oh
every
yeah.
once in a while. You know, just opportunities to say, "Hey, how was your son's football game last night?" Whatever. But we really tend to focus more on work when we're meeting in this virtual environment, as I said, with team agendas and things like that. So, how can you take care of people and their whole selves, as we talk about people bringing their whole selves to work? And so, I'm particularly bringing this up because, you know, in your case, Adnan, in Hong
Hmm.
Kong, we are facing the coronavirus
Oh
right
yeah.
now. And there are places closing, like
Hmm.
offices closing, travel has been restricted, and there's a lot of fear in Hong Kong right now about, you know, what's next, and maybe my office is closing, or I'm only working from home now, and I'm used to going into the office. So let's talk about that. How can we help teams that may be distributed and going through some kind of crisis that doesn't necessarily need to impact work, but really we need to be
It
caring for
really
people.
does. Right, right.
It does.
And I would say, the number one thing and most important thing is to acknowledge it, right? So
Mm,
don't pretend that there's not a problem and really acknowledge that things that are happening outside of the workplace really can affect an individual in terms of how they're performing
that's
and the
right.
productivity and the great ideas that they're bringing to the workplace. So, just with the coronavirus, I'll give you an example. We got an email from our CEO for all employees in Asia, just acknowledging we understand this is a very difficult situation and just reminding us that we always come first. So take care of
Mm,
yourself, take care of your families. If there's anything the company or work can do to take care of you and your families, you let us know
yeah.
because you're on the ground. So there was that level of acknowledgement. The empathy certainly came through, and also just empowerment to let our leaders know what we needed. And I just so appreciated that. It was one of those things I didn't realize I needed until I got it. And it was like, wow,
Mm,
how important is that? So, certainly you want to acknowledge that there's a problem and recognize that you may require some exceptional benefits in certain cases. So,
mm,
um, I've been working remotely for almost a month now, and many of my friends and coworkers out here, we're all working remotely, and that is certainly an exceptional situation.
mm-hmm,
We
mm-hmm.
have work flexibility, but to work 3 weeks outside of the office, I mean, that is an exceptional benefit, and it's something that most companies here have been very flexible towards. So just recognize that you may need to extend some exceptional benefits that you otherwise would not in some of
Mm-hmm.
these extraordinary situations.
And talking about working remote, we've got a friend in common who was basically temporarily relocated to London.
Right?
His company said, "We've got some things going on anyways. We would prefer you not to be in an area that's impacted by coronavirus. So, you know, why don't you just come?" And they got him a
Hmm.
hotel. And I mean, that's to me shows a lot of care for somebody who isn't necessarily even immediately dealing with it, but I just it goes a long way to say, you know, we care about you and your safety and well-being, and we'd
Hmm.
rather have you here in the headquarters anyway.
Right.
So why don't you come back?
Right. So there was almost an opportunity there to
Yes,
have a regroup with the team, which,
that's huge.
it's huge, right? And it's one of those things you don't. I know for distributed teams we have to recreate, but sometimes it just makes sense to hop on a plane and go,
Yes.
meet up with the team every now and then. And I'll say in this example here, it was one of those things where it worked well for the situation that
Hmm.
this individual found themselves in. So you might be able to use it as an opportunity for an on-site for
Yeah.
a project in situations like this. I think the most important thing also is not to panic. I think
Mm.
with especially globally distributed teams, you have things like viruses,
Hurricanes.
hurricanes, protest movements, there's elections throughout the world that have
Mhm.
disruptions to day-to-day life. There's a lot of factors in there. And the reality is life does go on, right? So
Yeah,
it's so important not to panic, acknowledge that there is a problem, work through the various options that are there, and continue onward, right? So keep on moving forward, stay in
that's
there, be
right.
resilient.
And I think too, if I think about the different challenges people go through, they may have their own opinions about how to solve it. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking particularly of a few women I've known who've lost husbands.
Mm,
And, the workplace has said, please take all the time you need. This is the season for you to focus on you. And they said, no, work is where I feel like everything's normal. And I don't have to think about, my life here without my loved one. So,
right.
being open to whatever that's going to look like for them. They may say I need some extra weeks off, or they might say I'd rather we just not talk about it
Right, right,
anymore. So don't forget to ask them what they need and just
right,
assume.
right. Give people the choice, right?
That's right.
Ultimately, we all have a unique relationship with our work. And for some people, coming into work provides stability, and giving people the option to have that is so important. I'll give you an example here. We have the option, if we want, it's not recommended, but we can go into the office because, of course, working from a single laptop screen, it's challenging, right? For many
Yeah,
of the complex initiatives that we run as change managers, it can be a challenging thing to do with just a tiny screen. So we do have the flexibility to go in for extraordinary situations if we need it. And it's just nice to have that option.
absolutely. Like, use your best judgment and letting employees decide for themselves.
Right, right. So important.
Spotlights on specific countries. We're going to be talking about different, leadership styles around the world. So if you are interested in continuing this conversation with us and not just listening on the podcast, we are starting a learning stream in the ChangeNerd community. So you may remember Brian Hampton came on in our season 2, and we talked about social learning, but also that he had the ChangeNerd outlet, and this is this great community. We were
Mm-hmm.
so excited to see that he was doing it because the world needs this thing. It's a
Absolutely.
place for people to collaborate, and he invited us to do a learning channel on global work and culture. So that's what we're going to be focusing on, and we'll also have the opportunity to continue the conversation. So log into changenerd.com, join the community, join the conversation. We'd love to see you there.
And we'd love to hear from you. I mean,
Absolutely.
we have these podcast sessions, and we do love getting emails. And this is a fantastic way for you to build on these conversations. Give us your insights. Are you on a globally distributed team? Are you leading a globally distributed team? How is that working for you? What's worked well for you? We'd love to hear it.